Species. Unite.
Maybe when we started doing this with animals, researching on them and studying them for human benefit hundreds of years ago, we didn't know about their sentience. We didn't know that they had emotions and feelings and felt pain. And we know all that now. We can't ignore that.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Novogratz. This is Species Unite. When journalist Melanie Kaplan agreed to foster a beagle named Hammy, she knew he'd just been released from a research lab. What she didn't know was how profoundly his story and the world he came from would change her own. In her new book, Lab Dog, a beagle and his human investigate the surprising world of animal research. Melanie takes readers deep inside the hidden world of animal testing, one that quietly breeds and experiments on tens of thousands of dogs each year, mostly beagles, chosen for their size and gentle nature. Through her journey with Hammy, she unravels how these animals end up in labs, what happens to them once they're there, and for the ones who get out, what it takes to help heal them. But Lab Dog isn't just an investigation. It's a love story. Welcome. It's really good to see you and have you here.
It's awesome to be here. I've just so enjoyed listening to your podcast. So thank you for all your work.
Well, thank you for your book. So your book comes out October 14th. We're going to talk about your book, but we're going to talk about this whole, how you got to this book, because I have talked to a lot of people over the years about research and testing and rescue of research and testing animals. So I felt like I went in knowing quite a bit, but I can't tell you how much I learned. You went deep. You went really, really deep. Yet there was so much story behind it that it never felt like I was just getting facts. It totally felt like I was involved in a story. I was on this journey with you. And congratulations for pulling that off, because it was awesome.
Thank you.
That could not have been easy. One thing I found super interesting was before all this, before you had Hammy, and then got really, really curious about where Hammy came from, exactly where Hammy came from. You had a beagle that you were madly in love with, Darwin. That was a purebred, beagle that you bought from a breeder. And how you went from a breeder purebred beagle to a lab tested on, beagle who lived in the most horrific circumstances, pretty much that there are for a dog. Will you talk about your first beagle and then how this evolved into Hammy?
I'll start off saying I grew up in a house where my parents had brought home a dachshund from Germany. My dad was stationed in Germany, and they brought home a dachshund, and they bred the dachshund with the dachshund down the street. And so we had dachshund puppies. So, the whole idea of breeding didn't seem unusual to me. And then even as a, very young adult, when I did get Darwin from a breeder, I, put a lot of time into thinking about what breed I wanted. I didn't want another dachshund because they always had back problems, but I really loved hounds, and I knew about Snoopy, so I knew about beagles. And so there were no red flags for me at that point, because I just didn't know that you're not supposed to buy from breeders, that we have so many dogs in shelters and dogs that need homes. And so I found, somebody must have recommended this breeder in North Carolina, and I drove down there and I picked up this dog. Her litter mates and maybe her parents were show dogs. And I thought that was cool because she had some pedigree. And looking back now, that's definitely not something I would do again. But I just didn't have that on my radar.
I just found it really not coincidental, but it's a great segue into what became basically your life later. You start with this beagle, and then now you're speaking for this entire industry and what we're doing to beagles. I think most people, at least most people I talk to, if I say we test on dogs, mostly beagles is usually how it goes, people are floored. They're stunned we test on dogs, and then you say, oh, it's beagles actually because they're so small, their size, and because they're so nice. And so they don't fight back. Talk about how you found out about this whole world and how you ended up with this beagle that you weren't going to keep.
So I had lost Darwin, and it had been a few years, and a friend of mine who had recently become an animal activist learned about the Beagle Freedom Project, and he gave me one of their calendars. So it's 12 months of beagles running on grass and looking happy and being free. And I was like, wait a minute, these dogs used to be in research labs? Like, what the heck? That planted a bug that turned into very quickly me going onto their website and signing up as a volunteer to be a foster. And yeah, that did not turn into a foster. So foster fail. And then, as you said, as I met people over the years, they were just shocked that this happened. And I think one of the last people before I decided I was going to write this book was a journalist friend of mine. And I was talking to him about it, and he said, "Is that legal?" And I knew that it was legal, but I didn't have the answers. I didn't have the information to tell him more. And I think that was the last straw. And I was like, I need to tell this story. And so I really went into this wanting to write something that anybody could pick up, whether it's my mother or a scientist or my neighbor down the street, and have a good understanding of what the history is and where we are today.
When you first went to foster Hammy, he was one of the DC-7, this group of dogs that got rescued from a lab by the Beagle Freedom Project, and you were just going to foster him. Did you really know anything yet at that point about what was happening in the dog testing world?
I only knew what I read from the Beagle Freedom Project. Their marketing material talked about dogs being used for pharmaceutical testing and cleaners and cosmetics, which I came to learn later was not exactly true in this country. And it talked about, 70,000 dogs in labs at that point. This was 2013. And that not many of them get out. And that he could have experienced some, he could have been used for some experiments. He could have experienced trauma. And the 7 families that were fostering these dogs had no idea what their background was. And we were told nothing about these specific dogs. We just knew that they were healthy enough to get out of the lab.
Everyone else that went in as a foster, did they end up keeping their dogs too? The 7 people?
Not everyone. I can think of one that ended up going to another family, but most of us did.
What a good trick of the Beagle Freedom Project. That's awesome. Because you're a journalist and you are wildly curious, then you just needed to know more. And you went on this incredible, how long were you doing research for this book? Because you talked to everyone and went everywhere.
It was years before I started because, for many years, I was just like, here's Hammy. He's got a tattoo in his ear. He was in research. And then when I finally turned the corner and realized this is the story I need to tell, it was probably, I'll just say that I started 4.5 years ago from now, and the book's going to be out in a couple weeks. I'll tell you what was finally made me realize I had to do this is I actually had a concussion during the pandemic. And so I was off screens for months. I couldn't work. I couldn't do anything. So I had the luxury of time and just being bored. And, when you're bored, all these creative things come up. And during this time, I was thinking a lot about my health. And of course, animals have been used for decades for head trauma research. And I was going to neurologists and physical therapists, and this whole time I was healing, Hammy was by my side. And so it was just, I really started processing more than I ever had before. our lives depend on animal research in so many ways for so many years they have. And it touches almost every part of our lives. And most people are unaware of it. And so as I was thinking about, well, what am I going to work on next? I just realized this is it. He's right next to me. I have to tell his story.
And he's with you the entire story. And we're learning his story as you're learning this bigger story, starting with the history of dogs and testing in general in the US. And that was one thing that got me so bad was like all the stolen dogs and dogs from the pound. And just like anywhere anyone could get a dog, they were selling them to research.
I can't imagine a dog having a life in a home and running around the yard and being with the kids, and then somebody swooping out from a van and picking him up. I mean, it's just, yeah, they're all heartbreaking stories.
And a lot of the experiments are horrific that these dogs go through. And like you said, the majority of these dogs never leave the lab. They are euthanized. Unless you're really thinking about this and learning about this, people think, oh, testing, cosmetics and drugs, medical research. But we test for so many things.
So the cosmetics is usually what comes up. People say, oh, I'm buying cruelty-free now, and buying cruelty-free shampoo is pretty easy these days, or cruelty-free makeup. I mean, it's easy to find. It's easy. A lot of companies have it. The ones that really got me were, and I knew drugs were tested, but I didn't know that they typically were tested on dogs. What it is they're tested on one small species, which is a rodent, a mouse or a rat, and then a non-rodent, which is usually a dog, sometimes a primate. And that means our prescription drugs, our over-the-counter drugs, and then there's this weird category of cosmetics that are also drugs. So it's like anti-dandruff shampoo or teeth whitening toothpaste. And then the pesticides really surprised me too. So you've got, the pesticides have to be still today tested on dogs. They're 90-day tests. They used to do year-long tests, and they've gotten that reduced to 90 days. But, anything. This is a bug spray. It's stuff we put on our crops. It's things that were, rodent killers, anything that's out to kill, including killing microbes, microbial wipes. Those are all pesticides. And the flea and tick things for dogs, those are tested on dogs. They've got dogs in labs, under awful circumstances that are testing out these new products. And the companies are always trying to make new products. So, instead of using dogs that are in homes and testing out products with those dogs, or, there seems like there's got to be a better way than having, ticks and fleas on dogs in cages only to euthanize them later.
At one point you say you're allowed to, or the researchers are allowed to do ticks and fleas together on a dog, but they don't because the dog's in so much agony of itching from the fleas, it'll scratch the ticks off, and they don't want that to happen.
And you can't hear about that without just like thinking, okay, what are we doing as a society? Of course, we don't want ticks and fleas on our dogs. We don't want all of our crops eaten by bugs. I'm a magnet for mosquitoes, and like they're the worst, but I don't use bug spray because, it's like I refuse to buy into that system now. Yeah, it's this big system that nobody knows about, that it's controlled by a lot of large corporations for the most part. And it's really hard to change at this point.
It's a system. And with so much of this, it's like, one small mammal and one bigger mammal for this drug that is going to fail in humans anyway, 95% of the time, isn't really a good system.
When insulin was discovered, it's been just over 100 years ago, they used dogs for that. And there was a dog named Marjorie who became, famous because she was the dog that led the researchers to, say, oh, we've discovered this thing. And I was talking to bioethicist Jessica Pierce, and she said, and this insulin success is something that people in the research community often talk about. So, oh, we wouldn't have insulin if we didn't have animal testing. And so Jessica Pierce said, we would have figured it out another way. And I think about that all the time. I mean, that was 100 years ago. We didn't have AI back then. We didn't have computer modeling. We didn't have Fitbits to track human data. And I believe she's right. I mean, I believe we would have figured it out if there was no animal testing, if that just wasn't an option. So it's interesting to think about the different paths that we could have gone down and the ones that we're not doing today because we're so focused on animal research.
It's amazing how much you actually got to see and people you got to talk to, because it's such a secretive world. Will you talk about that a little bit?
I had this fantastical approach when I started that I was going to meet the person who researched on Hammy and the person who bred him, because I was imagining like a backyard breeder. I don't know what I was picturing. I just had no idea. And I did not meet those people. It didn't take me long to figure out that, oh, this is going to be a little harder because I'm used to being a travel writer and I was writing about science here and there, but I was used to just going out and people would talk to me. They were happy to talk. And so I was really optimistic going into this. And I got a lot of emails that people never responded to me. A lot of people, researchers, they'd be stopped by their public affairs departments. They're like, no, thank you. He's going to pass on that opportunity. And then I had this one researcher who was willing to talk to me. He'd been researching on dogs his entire career. And he said, but I don't want you to use my name or the name of my university or the state I'm in or where I went to college. And they're, researchers and scientists who work with animals are really worried and really afraid. And a lot of them know someone who's been harassed. They are afraid that their work and what they say is going to be used out of context or the message isn't going to be clear. I want to be sensitive to that, but I also really want to tell the story. I want to tell the story in a way people can understand. I want to shed light on this topic that, like you said, people don't know about it. It's been in the dark. And I think people deserve to know so we can make choices about how we vote and what we buy and how we talk about this. I mean, this is a really important topic. And, maybe when we started doing this with animals, researching on them and studying them for human benefit hundreds of years ago, we didn't know about their sentience. We didn't know that they had emotions and feelings and felt pain. And we know all that now. We can't ignore that.
I mean, it was up until the 80s, we still didn't think animals felt pain, felt physical pain. It's a lot of justification for doing a lot of bad things, but now we know. And we're doing a lot of bad things. I mean, to animals across the board.
And even if we're not doing the bad things to these animals in the lab, maybe they're just the control subjects. Maybe they're just there, like, on deck in case they're needed for an experiment. And, I often wonder, well, Hammy came out of there in good health. He was traumatized for sure, but I think his health was pretty good. But even if he was just there, he wasn't able to be a dog. He didn't sniff around. He didn't have new experiences or smells. I mean, we've domesticated dogs because we want them in our lives. And then we put them in this sterile environment. And we're doing that with tens of millions of other animals too.
That's one of the things I think that's so powerful about your book, because you're telling the story of Hammy and you and your relationship and his evolution. So we're all falling in love with this dog, and the way we fall in love with any dog that we know, deeply. And at the same time, you're telling the story of these hundreds of thousands of dogs through the years that have, a lot of them, gone through living hell. The stuff from the medical schools, there's just a ton of terrible stories. And so you're like, wait a minute, these are our best friends, or these are our torture subjects? And so it's very not confusing, because I think most people who read this think of dogs as their best friends, most people. But it's reading it in that context where you're also reading about Hammy. It just shines a much bigger, brighter light on what we're doing. Not just to dogs, we're to over 100 million animals a year. It's brutal, what we're doing. The one thing I thought was so great, and you didn't make this happen, but in your book, while you're writing this book, it just so happens, and you're really trying to get to the bottom of where your dog came from. It just so happens the Envigo thing happened, which is probably the biggest news in the history of the U.S. dog breeding, testing, everything. At least the biggest news since we stopped testing on chimpanzees was that Envigo story.
I'm just getting the chills thinking about how that played out because, it started when Peter released the undercover video of what was happening at Envigo.
Say what Envigo is.
Envigo was the second largest breeder of dogs for research. And this is a facility in Cumberland, Virginia. And it had been breeding dogs for decades. I think it was the 60s that they started. And it changed hands so many times. And I think there was a period in the 70s, it changed hands almost every year. It'd get bought by a bigger company. So all these acquisitions. And, eventually it was owned by a company called Covance, which owned it when Hammy was born. And then Envigo bought it. I think these companies, maybe they didn't know what they were getting into. They didn't know the problems that already existed at the facility. But time after time, they had Animal Welfare Act violations for all sorts of things. There were bugs in the food. There were dogs fighting and not getting medical care. Dogs would have a fight wound and they'd be euthanized rather than treated. It was just, these violations were stacking up. And so PETA hired someone to go in there undercover. And they released this video from that in November 2021. And it really, as you know, just from there, USDA went back in and did another inspection, found additional violations and repeated violations. And that's really when lawmakers and other animal welfare groups found out about it. Some of the dogs started being adopted out, a small number. And then in the summer of 2022, after Envigo said, we're not going to put the money into this to, get it up to code and take care of all these violation problems, they decided they were going to shut down the facility. And what was then Humane Society of the United States, now Humane World for Animals, found organizations across the country, partner shelters and rescue groups to adopt out more than 4,000 beagles. Every time I read this in the book, when I was editing, I get to this point where the beagles are going all across the country and into these homes, and it just makes me so happy. It's just hard not to smile when that's happening. And yes, the fact that this happened in the middle of my reporting was just amazing because, first of all, just the story was incredible and it creates this kind of suspense and drama, and we're going into the courtroom and trying to, learn what's going to happen to all these dogs. But also because I thought, oh, now everybody will know this is happening because it was in headlines across the country. And I found out that not everybody knows now. People still don't know.
A couple things. One, when you say, oh, and these guys might not have known what they were getting into, like Envigo and Inotiv and Covance, it's all the same guys. They just keep switching companies. It literally is. If you talk to Eric Kleiman in your book from Animal Welfare Institute, or used to be there, who is like the most knowledgeable person on earth about all this stuff.
He is.
He will just tell you every connection of every person that's ever worked at any of those companies. It's astonishing. Because I think it takes a special kind of person to want to breed animals for research.
I'm probably giving them the benefit of the doubt that they didn't know what they were getting into. Because you know what? They definitely never returned my calls. The breeders, I never talked to one of them. They have no reason to talk to me. But and wanting to tell the full story, like I wanted to hear their side of the story. I wanted to hear how they feel like, they were doing what they could and they put money into it. And I wanted to hear that from them, but I never heard back.
Well, the COO of Envigo during the Beagle thing, Jim Harkness, and you talk about him in your book. So when all that went down and Envigo had to pay $32 million, Clean Water Act, animal welfare fines, the whole thing, the biggest Clean Water Act fine in the history of the Clean Water Act, he left Envigo and he started a new company called Safer Human Medicine, which, because he's not allowed to breed dogs anymore, that company, the reason I know this is we just made a short film about this whole thing, is trying to put a breeding facility in Bainbridge, Georgia with 30,000 monkeys in these people's town. And he's running that. Fortunately, the people of Bainbridge have been fighting this thing like crazy for the past 2 years, and they still haven't broken ground.
Yeah, I can't wait to see the documentary. I don't know if it's still up there, but when I was finishing reporting the book, I went to their website and Safer Human Medicine, and it said something like, animal welfare is our top priority. You just have to laugh.
Yeah.
Really?
This is a really long aside, but so when I've told people about the monkey farm in Georgia and that it's the same guy from the Beagles in Virginia, thinking that everybody remembers and knows the Beagles in Virginia, everyone's like, huh? And I think in part because we have so much news coming in every 5 minutes. And if you're not in this world at all, that's like a crazy story when you hear it, and then it goes, and there's a new crazy story the next day. And memory just doesn't contain it because there's just too much going on, clearly now.
Yeah.
I found that really surprising how many people don't remember the Envigo Beagles. When it really wasn't that long ago. But I'm so glad you tell their story, and their story is such a big part of your book. You were there in Cumberland at the breeding facility the last day of the rescues. Will you talk about what that was like?
It was really emotional. I was just so nervous driving there. I didn't know for sure it was going to be the last day because nobody would tell me. It was all supposed to be confidential, and I just got tipped off that it might be the last day. And by this point, I knew that's where Hammy was born. And so, it was a cool fall day, and he and I drove down, and I talked to the different rescue groups that had come with their vans to pick up dogs. And so all through the morning, they're, sending their vans onto the property with an HSUS person from the Humane Society. And they get filled up with beagles, and they drive them back out to the driveway outside the gate because nobody was allowed on the property. And then these rescue groups, they would drive, home with a van full of beagles to Fort Wayne and to New Jersey and, Kentucky. And then Ham and I were just waiting, and the vans were gone, and he was sniffing around. It's just on this country road, and you would never know there was a beagle breeder there. And then the Humane Society of the United States van came out, which was also full of beagles, and they were going up to their rehab center in Maryland. And then I was like, wow, well, that must be it. And it was just such a crazy feeling to know that for decades, easily 1 million dogs would have been bred there, right? Because when you hear that there's like 5,000 dogs at that facility, that's at any given time. And we don't know exactly what the turnover is each year. So how many times each year are they breeding 5,000 dogs? And this had been going on since the 60s. So, just thinking about all of those individuals, and it's really hard to think about a big number. But then I had this one individual with me, this one who'd been born there and who had, he had a life in a lab, and now he's having a life out of the lab, and he'd seen so much and was wondering what all the others had seen and how many of them died before they even got sold to a lab. And it was a lot of feels. It was just, one of the most important parts of the book for me.
It was just very emotional. And such a big moment for all these people too who've been fighting so hard to get dogs out of labs, to rescue them, to rehome them. Like, there are a lot of people doing a lot of behind the scenes on this.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because, this was great for me to be able to tell Hammy's story, but it also just felt good to be able to tell all these other stories of people that are not telling their own stories, or they're afraid to tell their stories, or they're, including like animal care workers, people that work in the labs, or lab animal veterinarians. Of course, all of the people working in animal welfare and trying to, make sure that the animals who are in the labs are treated well. And everybody's got a story. And so one of the things that was so much fun for me is to talk to people, on all parts of it. And it's complicated. It's not just the researchers and the activists. Like you said, there's a lot of people involved.
I thought it was interesting when you were talking about the guy, I can't think of his name, at Kindness Ranch.
John Raymer, saying they want to be in good graces with the labs, or they're not going to give them the dogs or the animals, right? So everyone's just being really nice to each other because they want the animals, or whatever, even if they can get 2% of what's in there, that's worth not, saying anything bad about what's going on behind the scenes. And it makes sense, but it's complicated, like you say. And in some states, it's becoming more normal to adopt out animals from labs. Is that? Yes, I think now there are, if I'm correct, I think there's 17 states that have passed those adoption laws. So what that means, and each state is a little different, so it's confusing, but generally it means it covers companion animals. So dogs and cats that are used for research have to be adopted out after the research is done. If the researchers deem that they're healthy enough or that they can go into homes. But a lot of states have wanted to get, their bills included some kind of reporting mechanism. So the labs would have to say, okay, we used 60 dogs and we euthanized 50 of them and 10 of them got adopted out. But usually those reporting measures in the bill are killed. So the adoption bills don't have any reporting requirements, which means we still don't know how many of the dogs are euthanized versus adopted out. They're not, they don't keep records on those, or we don't know them as the public. They're not posted online anywhere. And also, I think generally it's up to the labs to say, oh, this one can be adopted out and this one can't. And, I just don't know that there's the oversight that a lot of people would like to see on this, that these bills are great because it does get dogs out, but it's not really, I don't know how much it's changing things in terms of monitoring and understanding what's going on.
What makes a dog adoptable versus this one needs to be euthanized? And if it's the lab that's deciding, I'm sure there's certain labs that don't really think anybody's adoptable.
For the labs, in one of their defenses against these bills, they say, well, we're not in the business of adoption. And it takes them time because they might have to, they're not training the dogs, but they might start taking them out on a leash to go to the bathroom outside, or there's certain things that they do to make the transition easier into a home. Some of them just do nothing. So it does mean that they have to do more work. But I also know that the animal techs that have to euthanize animals, they don't love that. I would imagine that them knowing a dog is going into a home would be much better than having another one that they have to say goodbye to.
In a lot of these labs, and it's so many other kinds of animals too, there's just so many animals that it must be hard for them even to see that dog as a dog when there's, 200 other dogs all barking in cages. I'm sure there's a numbness that goes along with these jobs that you would have to be numb or, really detached to be able to go there every day. You go into the world of alternatives in your book too. What of the ones that you learned about and saw and or talked to people about, what was the coolest?
Well, I got a tour of the Emulate lab up in Boston, and Emulate makes the organ chips that basically mimics a human organ. And we can, they're like they're like this big, like a thumb drive size, and you can bend them. And if you hook them up to a machine, they can actually breathe, and you can add bacteria or drugs to them and see how the organ, cells respond. And they seem really promising. I mean, all the big pharmaceutical companies are using them now, and the FDA is using them. We are not at the point where we have an entire human body to model the human body. So, a lot of animal researchers say, oh, we're just not there. In fact, the people that make the organ chips still also say we're not there. And that until we see how something affects the whole body, we are going to have to keep testing on animals. But the good news is that there is going to be more resources devoted to developing these alternatives and really looking at human relevant methods, because, all of these animal models, I mean, they're models, but they're not humans. And if we can create something just through innovation and AI and technology that is really a model for a human, I mean, that's what we want to do, because these are all about human medicines. They're not about mouse medicines.
When it comes to other things like pesticides, I mean, aside from the fact that we're testing this stuff on animals, we're also pouring it into our soil and eating it. It's not good across the board, but is there hope for those animals in that sense?
I think the EPA, I mean, they are really engaged with using non-animal methods, and they did cut down from the year dog test to the 90-day dog test. And I know that they've been in discussions for years about getting rid of the 90-day dog test. So there is hope. I mean, I'm really optimistic between all the non-animal methods and the number of people that really want to see it go in that direction. And, I think that the companies are really, the pesticide companies are definitely ready to move away from dogs. I mean, one of them that I talked to said, if we didn't have this requirement from the government, like, we would stop testing on dogs tomorrow. So they're just doing it because the regulators need to see this animal data to make sure that, it's safe. The animals haven't gotten cancer or birth defects, or, they need to know all of these things so they can feel like it's safe for human health. And the regulators have just been looking at animal data for all these years. And so they're trying to change that. Yeah.
Which is hopeful. Did you feel hopeful by the time you got through all the, I mean, I'm sure you were like horrified when you started, right? But like, how did you go emotionally through this whole journey?
Oh gosh. I mean, it was, my emotions were so tied into Hammy. And, I think by the end, I don't know. I mean, I do feel optimistic today. I think being a little bit removed from the manuscript has helped. I just felt really glad that I could tell the story in the way that I hoped to, and that I could tell Hammy's story.
And you told a beautiful story, and thank you for sharing it with us.
Oh, Elizabeth, thank you so much.
To learn more about Melanie, to read Lab Dog, go to our website, speciesunite.com. We will have links to everything. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at Species Unite. If you have a spare moment and could do us a favor, please subscribe, rate, review on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps people find the show. I would like to thank everyone at Species Unite, including Gary Knudsen, Caitlin Pierce, Amy Jones, Paul Healy, Santina Polke-Link, Hannah Gabrielson, Bethany Jones, and Anna Kolner, who wrote and performed today's music. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.